is not going to be as simple as just a flick of the switch. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is that best practices for hygiene will require new rules for businesses. Joining us is attorney Sarah Bronin. She's also a city planning and zoning chair. And Sarah, you say that most zoning laws will have to have quick, radical reform. So I want to talk about how that might look here in Massachusetts. In the city of Boston, a sidewalk cafe, it can't extend beyond the frontage of a restaurant, and it can only take up about 6 feet of space from the front door. But some health experts say the space between the diners, the ventilation of the outdoors, it limits the spread of the virus, so it would be great. So then how do you see restaurants adjusting, and how will the city need to respond?
Good morning, Elizabeth. So as you say, restaurants, when they reopen, are going to have to try to reopen safely. And one of the things they're going to run up against as they try to move their operations outside are zoning laws that are pretty outdated and that restrict things like outdoor cafes. So Boston and lots of other cities around the country are going to have to start tackling those zoning laws and opening them up.
Massachusetts is one of the few states in the country that requires businesses to accept cash, but many states say that transactions in the new normal should actually be touchless. So I'm curious if you think that we might see a temporary or even a permanent change to that law.
This is another thing legislators are going to have to grapple with. So in Boston, 10% of residents are unbanked. That means they don't have a checking account or a savings account. So what does that do if you are going to a store, you can't pay with a card because you don't have a card that connects to an account? So this is, again, an important question they're going to have to grapple with, but you can't leave people behind, especially during a pandemic.
That's really interesting. A lot of zoning laws, of course, require a minimum number of parking spots outside for businesses, but you say that needs to change. Why is that?
Well, minimum parking requirements are probably the scourge of the modern American city. They create traffic, they degrade street life, and they actually drive up prices. So in Boston, you have minimum parking requirements of up to 2 parking spaces for every apartment unit that's built. And you have for retail space, a couple parking spaces too that might be required for even a very small retailer. So those changes and the lifting of the minimum parking requirements needs to happen now in order to allow cafes and even retailers to use their parking lots for other uses. But Mayor Walsh and City Council President Janey, if you're listening, those changes, you should really consider making them permanent.
It's really interesting. I'm also curious why you think street closures will become an important part of this conversation.
So you're seeing this already all over the country. You're seeing Oakland, LA, Nashville. They've started to close their streets. Where you have a lot of density and your sidewalks force people to be too close together, you've got to give them a little bit more space. So streets are really the place to look. Even New York City is actually looking at this. If you don't close streets, though, lots of cities are making them slow. So it's just called the slow streets movement. And what that does is it slows cars, especially when you might have pedestrians and bikers in the streets. That's something else that cities should consider.
When we're dining outside, it is so pleasant in the summertime when we're not in the midst of a pandemic. It is also, there's a novelty to the fact of, when streets get closed and you can kind of walk in and out of your favorite shops. So I'm curious as to, in terms of this being a necessary change in our culture, is this going to be something that we'll kind of dip into and then we'll go back to the former rules once a vaccine is available? Or do you think this is here to stay and it'll actually change the face of cities and towns?
So I think people are going to start to like some of the looser restrictions on land use that you might see during the pandemic. And as they start to express their approval for outdoor cafe, for street life, I think you are going to see more policies that will more permanently reclaim streets for people. And whether that's the parking of streets and places where we've allowed the car to dominate, whether that's the streets or parking lots. So I'm hopeful actually that we'll see a relaxation of some of the very strict rules that have driven up prices around the country, and they've actually hurt street life and hurt the vibrancy of neighborhoods. So we think about it this way: a little messiness on the sidewalk actually leads to a lot more vibrancy in the neighborhood.
You're right when you say, it's been the American way for cars to dominate. But I'm curious when that's changed. You're the chair of the planning board in Hartford, Connecticut, and these were many of the changes that are already in place there. Why did that town shift, and how has it transformed your community?
Yeah, so in Hartford, about 4 years ago, we completely overhauled the zoning code, and we were the first city in the country to completely eliminate minimum parking requirements for all uses. So that's a mouthful, but what we've really done with that requirement and a lot of other things in our zoning code is said that the city is for people. The city isn't for cars. The city is an equitable place. The city can be a sustainable place. And so we've really put all of those kind of rules in place, and they're benefiting us right now during the pandemic because we only have to make a few modest changes to really open up, some of these to address some of the health issues that we're seeing, and which we are doing. We are making those changes, but we're hopeful that Boston and other places will follow our lead and really open up the cities once again.
It's interesting to see there's a shift in the quality of life when you start to do those things. It'll be interesting to see how the face of all these cities and towns change. Sarah, thanks so much for joining us this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Gene?